This week's Cultural Astronomy Seminar, we are blessed with two amazing speakers. We're going to have Elizabeth Brooker and Professor Martin Nakata. So they're going to be talking about the cultural interface and mostly about the cultural interface as a theoretical framework we should really be focusing on in our work in cultural astronomy. So Elizabeth is working with us, with Professor Nakata, Sana Nakata, and I at JCU on a PhD looking at Torres Strait systems of knowledge around the stars. And Professor Martin Nakata is the Deputy Vice Chancellor Indigenous at JCU. I sent around a bio yesterday in the email about this. So without further ado, Elizabeth is going to speak first, and then Professor Knocker is going to come in after that, and then there might be some time later on for some Q&A and discussion, which would be great. So Elizabeth, you want to kick us off?
Sure.
Excellent.
I will just add that if there is a comment from someone in the room, if you could repeat it, we hear your audio a lot clearer than we're going to hear anybody in the room.
Great.
So, cool. Okay, well, I wanted to um, present today for a couple reasons. First of all, Jarita Holbrook informed me after my presentation at the conference that every sentence sounded like a question mark. And so I need to practice presenting. This will be very helpful for me in general. So um, thank you for allowing me to do that. Like Professor Hamaker said, I've been working with him and Professor Martin Nakata and also Professor Sana Nakata at the James Cook University remotely. I'm in Florida, where it is midnight, just for fun facts. But it has been a really big learning process for me. So I started in cultural astronomy with Steve Goldberg at the University of Oklahoma. And I did a whole thesis project with him about Torres Strait astronomy. And we did a lot of work with Esley's Notebook, which is a record of Indigenous star knowledge as recorded by a Torres Strait Islander. But it's been translated, and all of that work that I did with Professor Goldberg, and the reason why I even had it was because it was also with Dwayne, was really based on quantitative analysis. Like, okay, how can we compare quantitative analysis with this Torres Strait Islander astronomy? This is so cool. How accurate is it? And doing like percentages and rating it from like 1 to 4 um, on not just accuracy, but then understanding like percentages of anyway, it was fascinating. But when I started with Professor Nakata, I realized that I really have a lot to learn about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems and more responsible ways to work with Indigenous knowledge systems. So I feel like Professor Martin is the expert on that, and he will talk mostly about that. But for me, because I started really at ground zero, I wanted to take a couple minutes with what I've learned in basic, like definitions, even that have helped me to understand what the cultural interface is, why it's important, and um, how to be aware of it, especially as a non-Indigenous researcher. So, um, Dwayne, can you go to the next slide? So the first, I guess, definition to start off with is this idea of a worldview. And it comes up a lot in the literature, but you don't see a lot of definitions. You kind of just are supposed to understand what it means. So the definitions that I've included here are, so it's an unspoken principles that define beliefs, assumptions, concepts, and values. So worldview is something that is experienced within each culture. Um, and it is unspoken. So a lot of times this is implicit, not often explicit, but it's the core of culture. So it's what defines why they believe what they believe, what assumptions are happening, what concepts, why do they value certain things. That's all part of this worldview definition. Um, and within this worldview is the idea that um, a culture's worldview is going to determine your experienced reality. Um, and it also, the worldview is going to define um, it's going to determine what's defined as knowledge, and it's going to guide the societal priorities and choices and actions. Um, and that was just shared by Held in 2019. Can you go to the next slide, Dwayne? So additional vocabulary to understand in this process is the idea of reflexivity, which is often used, but specifically talks about how life is filtered by experience. And I think that we all can understand that in many different aspects, but specifically within culture, life is filtered by experience. And experience is this word that ties in with all of these ideas of worldview and reflexivity. Um, and the idea is that if you're an observer of another culture, um, when you observe another culture, you actually are taking those observations and inserting it in your own worldview, in your own filter, in your own perspectives. And so, while people like Haddon had great ideas to go and observe other cultures and try and record Indigenous knowledge, what's happening is their experience of the other culture is actually filtering it as they're recording it. And so it just becomes a new knowledge in and of itself. It's kind of like taking part of one in the context of another, and then it's not it had no integrity to either one of the original knowledges or worldviews. And worldview itself is a kind of filter in how we experience things. The third definition to talk about, and these both reflexivity and standpoint theory are things that Jarita Holdbrook talked about in her talk at the Cultural Astronomy School. She talks about standpoint theory from the perspective of feminine standpoint theory. In the article that was sent in the readings email, there was a discussion about Indigenous standpoint theory, which I'm sure Professor Martin will talk more about later. But it's the idea that it's the marginalized communities that have the most holistic understanding of knowledge because they've had to live in both worlds and they know both worldviews, both Western and Indigenous simultaneously. Um, and that's just something to understand about how that works. Can you go to the next slide? So, this conversation was interesting to me that I had with another student at the astronomy school while I was in Melbourne. And it's the idea of Indigenous knowledge versus Indigenous knowledge systems. And those are not synonymous. And in talking with a couple of the other students, they did not understand that. And I did not understand that when I first started this. So, Indigenous knowledge is it's the product of experience. It is how a culture has encoded ways to include all of their understanding of the environment, of relationships with environment, of predicting environment, um, and it's connected to the cultural logic and frameworks. I am an analogy person, and so I came up with my own analogy. And as I was thinking about this, getting ready to present this about 5 minutes ago, I came up with a totally different analogy. So I'll use this one and then I'll show you the new one that I was thinking. But so to me, Indigenous knowledge is like the tip of the iceberg. So the iceberg is the indigenous knowledge system. And as a researcher, we see the tip of the iceberg and we think, oh, that's so interesting. I want to use that fact, that knowledge and put it in my research and it'll be so interesting. But the point is it's connected to the rest of that iceberg. It's connected to ways of knowing, it's connected to worldview, it's connected to indigenous frameworks. And so you, you can't just remove a part of the iceberg and still hope to keep the integrity of the original knowledge. It's there's no way. There's so much included and embedded in indigenous knowledge that you can't remove a piece of it and put it into a Western framework and hope to still maintain its integrity. Um, and the best analogy for that, not even analogy, but so it really just becomes a discrete fact if you take indigenous knowledge and remove it from the system that it was um, theorized and the logic that was applied and the experience and the whole process of creating that knowledge. Once it's removed, it can't go back and forth between the two. Um, Go ahead. Or, well, no, before going to the next slide, this was the new analogy that I thought of today, um, in rereading the articles that were sent for the readings for today. I was really struck with the idea of how much Professor Martin focuses on the growing dynamic aspect of Indigenous knowledge systems and how they're constantly adapting and changing. So, I guess my new analogy for Indigenous knowledge versus Indigenous knowledge systems would be like a tree. And you can't remove a single leaf from a tree and expect to still have the same representation of knowledge. And the tree is going to continue to grow and change, and that leaf won't have a place. You can't then attach it back into the tree and expect it to still represent where the tree is now and how much it's grown and changed and learned. Maybe that's a poor analogy, but bear with me. All right. Yeah, if we can go to the next one. So the result of these keywords is knowledge fragmentation. And so in these indigenous, not in ethnographic records of indigenous knowledge, such as the work done by Haddon and many other anthropologists and researchers, is that the knowledge is fragmented when documented and presented as indigenous knowledge. It's actually not representative of the knowledge system that it came from. And then some limitations of that are due to, like, for example, in Haddon's um, case, he was only in the Torres Strait for a short amount of time. He only was able to visit a few of the islands, and he was not an astronomer. So those would be obvious limitations in his efforts to document Indigenous knowledge, but that's not the extent of it. The core issue is the idea that when you take knowledge from a system with a completely different framework and now you try and fit it into a Western framework, there's a compartmentalization and a categorization that and there are assumptions in Western frameworks that change the way that the knowledge um, is interpreted and understood, and it loses the integrity from when it was first created. Um, then, along the same line, so once it's removed from the cultural context, um, and we see it from Western frameworks, we're actually seeing something totally different, in that it does change through our framework perspectives. And unfortunately, along with that, part of that fragmentation is the idea that we kind of expect this knowledge to stay the same in so it's called the museumification of knowledge, which is that we expect that we can just take a fact, take some indigenous knowledge, put it on the shelf like you would an artifact in a museum, and it should stay the same and it should always apply. But because indigenous knowledge systems are dynamic and alive, it doesn't translate like that. And unfortunately, sometimes in that process, as a Western researcher, we tend to take indigenous knowledge and it becomes like a cultural curiosity, which sounds fun, but is obviously not respectful and it's not accurate. So it's really impossible to correct historical inaccuracies from knowledge fragmentation. And the point that Professor Nakata has made is that we need new methodological approaches with Indigenous knowledge to really better um, communicate it, to understand it, to help change the attitudes and the dialogue around it. Uh, Professor Nakata, I was hoping that maybe you could share an example of ways that the Torres Strait Islander knowledge has been fragmented. I didn't want to share an experience that was your own, um, but I know you have many, and
Uh,
I'm putting you on the
so
spot. So,
let me think. Perhaps I'll use this one. So uh, I'm Kulkalag. That's our belonging. So my name is a name that's associated with a place. So Kulka Laig. Laig actually literally translates as belonging to. So I belong to Kulka, and Kulka is a place. But when Haddon wrote it up, Kulka, not so much Haddon, but his linguist on the trip, his associate, wrote that up as Kulka, meaning several things. But what prominence they gave to that word was the word, its equivalent for the word blood. So in those days, they were really hunting for knowledge about primitive races. And so what surfaced in their work was really about these bloodthirsty people. But when I investigated some of the records that they captured of the color schemes and the nomenclature, there was a mention there also that associated more to our understanding of what Kulkalite means. And Kulka is literally for us means the place where the sun comes up. And when you see when the sun comes up over the ocean, and our island is a peak, and if you're in to the west of us, you'll be able to see this as a place where people come from, where the sun comes up. But through the following 100 years, we were known as the bloodthirsty people.
thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I don't know a better way to illustrate how it's been fragmented other than those kinds of experiences. So thank you, Professor Martin. Um, Professor Dwayne, can you go to the next slide? So inherent in this conversation is an important distinction between Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. And again, I'm coming at this from this is part of my journey and the things that I've learned on this process. And I fully recognize that many, if not all of you in this room already know all of this. And so I appreciate your patience as I am kind of sorting through this process and what it's meant for me to understand some of these core differences. So, knowledge, when we talk about Western knowledge, I'll start with that because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. But Western knowledge is learned by measures of competency. We've all taken exams, we've all written essays to prove that we understand things in school. Like that is how Western knowledge measures if you have mastered something. It's just how well you understand it mentally. Versus in Indigenous knowledge, it's learned by practice and it's determined that you understand something because you've survived. and you're learning an actual a way of living, not just a conceptual idea. Additionally, in Western knowledge, um, we are trained through like the scientific method. It is all about separating knowledge to understand its parts, right? We do experiments to figure out, okay, well, now I know how this gear works in this motor, or I understand how this theory works in physics, and now I'm going to compare that with this theory in chemistry, and but it's all about breaking it down to understanding like this core truth that we're trying to find. But in Indigenous knowledge, knowledge is about connection. And so that's reflected in how knowledge is shared, which is often with stories and dance. And that's why we see in Indigenous knowledge connections between stars and weather and uh, health and death. And all of those things are connected because that is what they're aiming for. Indigenous knowledge is about connecting the people with location and connecting it all together, as opposed to Western knowledge, where we're trying to, you know, piece it all apart, figure out how it all works. Um, in Western knowledge, also, we are all about static facts and absolutes. So, um, I'm sure Gayard could go all into this with different theories of, the scientific history and all those different aspects, but it goes into like a single line of knowing where we want to find this universal system of scientific theory that will explain everything. Like Einstein was all about that. And that's part of the scientific revolution system, is that we're trying to find a theory that is going to explain everything. But in Indigenous knowledge, it isn't like that. It's about a plurality of knowing, and it's about being adaptable and dynamic. And in the article that was sent as readings for this, there was a conversation about how how Professor Nakata was learning about dugong hunting, and how as he got older, as there were different limitations on environmental changes um, and the habitat and circumstances that dugong lived in, the stories changed of how to hunt the dugong, because it was their knowledge was growing and changing. And it wasn't like they had to memorize a story that was from 50 years ago that didn't apply anymore, because that serves no purpose. It was about understanding now, and growing and learning with that. And so, in that way, also, knowledge in Western mindset is a noun, and it's an object. It's something to learn and recite. But in Indigenous knowledge, it's a verb. And knowledge is something that is learned in collaboration between teacher and student, and it's synthesized together. It isn't just to be imparted from one person to the next. And along with that, in Indigenous knowledge, there's this concept of knowledge stewardship. And so often one of the aspects of the relationship with Torres Strait Islander knowledge and ethnographic records, again, goes back to Haddon, but he had approached the islanders and he wanted to record islander knowledge. But what he found is that when he asked the younger generations on the islands, they wouldn't tell him anything. They'd say, "Oh, you need to go talk to the elders for that." And hadn't assumed that that meant they didn't understand their culture and their culture was going to become extinct because it wasn't being passed down. But really, what that was a reflection of was this stewardship of knowledge, and how it was the elders' stewardship to be able to share that knowledge, not the young people. And not that they weren't passing that knowledge down. They were still in charge of their own knowledge and how it was being shared. It just wasn't done in the way that Haddon understood. And so that was a big misunderstanding there. So the point in emphasizing the two, and um, I put these in just two categories, right? Which is kind of its own issue because now it's a dichotomy, and obviously all cultures are going to treat things differently. So it's kind of a disservice to even call it indigenous knowledge versus Western knowledge because there is no set, like indigenous knowledge doesn't really exist. It's each individual culture. But the point in putting these together like this is the idea that we could somehow verify that Western knowledge is true by putting it in Indigenous knowledge system, or vice versa, that we could verify Indigenous knowledge by sticking it in a Western knowledge system with Western frameworks. And the point is you can't. They aren't even, they're not even the same thing. How could you compare them? And and that was another question that came up in the astronomy school, where there was a researcher from, I think she was from Indonesia, and she was like, "Hey, my colleagues are always asking me, but is it true? Is this even, I mean, is this even valid?" And the point, and I had a conversation with her after the lecture, was that that's not a valid question. And the importance of being able to understand really what it means for these frameworks and worldviews and how different they really are and what um, I keep saying disservice, but how disrespectful it is to expect knowledge from one system to verify knowledge from another system. And it goes both ways. Like Indigenous knowledge can't verify Western knowledge. We can't verify Indigenous knowledge, nor do we need to. And that is goes into this next question of how can we develop more respectful and accurate methodologies for future research? And so, Professor Dwayne, if you could go to the next slide. So this idea was brought up by Annette Lee um, in much of her research. Unfortunately, she did not present at the conference, but um, in looking at her papers and things since then, it's this idea of two-eyed seeing. And so she talks about it in the perspective of education, and she's focused on you can have your Western perspective here, but you can also have indigenous perspectives here, and they don't have you don't have to put them into each other's frameworks and make them lose context and not make sense, but to train yourself to see both. And I felt like there was some connection here with the conversation we had with Gerd with um, the plurality and scientific um, frameworks and theories, and how it's important to be able to have multiple theories, like even in the context of Kuhn's revolution of scientific theory, right? There's never one that's going to cover everything. Something's going to be excluded. And so the value of having multiple theories and having someone who's familiar with multiple theories is invaluable because now you can help other people understand in multiple ways. Um, so the other connection here besides the two-eyed seeing is it's also illustrated as the double canoe in the Maori culture and the two-row wampum, which is I meant to include a picture of it here, but it's just a woven uh, piece, and it has two separate um, tracks, I guess, of colored thread woven through it. And that's better visualized, I think, in the next slide here with this idea of the cultural interface. So in my mind, the way that I see the cultural interface is like two railroad tracks that run parallel to each other. And the point being that you keep Indigenous knowledge in Indigenous frameworks and you keep Western knowledge in Western frameworks because that's where they belong and that's where they make sense and that's where they have meaning and context and that's where they were realized, and that's where they should stay. But within that, there will be times when you will find bridges. You will find times where there is a connection between the two different frameworks, and then you can build bridges. And can you go to the next slide there, Professor Dwayne? So the point is that to build these bridges is also really tricky because, again, you're not going to take Western knowledge and put it into an Indigenous framework. It's not just like piecemealing it out. It's not parachuting knowledge, which is a terminology we learned at the conference, but it's connecting and seeing how these two knowledges can synergize at that point with that specific instance, but not all the way down the line. There's still two separate railroad tracks. They just happen to have a bridge at one place. And in order to do that most responsibly as researchers, that's going to require working with individuals in Indigenous communities as partners, um, and not situations like where I'm trying to analyze Esley's notebook and try to make sense of what he's saying in my Western frameworks, but to have Indigenous people working and collaborating and contributing to help um, give the context that you need so you can build an appropriate bridge that actually has good foundation in both knowledge systems. So, in that, Indigenous knowledge systems also might be able to inform broader scientific frameworks. And scientific frameworks can also help broaden Indigenous knowledge systems. It's that synergistic relationship that is possible, but only when you have representation and real representation from both knowledge systems. So, can we go to the next slide, Dwayne? So, as part of this, I'm just a little too methodical in my thinking. And so I needed to understand how I could better understand Indigenous knowledge. And so, as part of that, it was helpful for me to identify like what are some of the foundational elements that um, help me understand uh, the ways that these are different, and not even just understanding how they're different, but just to understand Indigenous knowledge systems. And so, four words that have come up in that practice are understanding the ontology, so realizing the nature of reality within a culture, the epistemology, so what is knowledge's role in that society, understanding what the core values are, and then how are those things understood within that culture. And that's just like that would be like kindergarten level of how to start understanding Indigenous knowledge systems and recognizing differentials between what you may understand and what the Indigenous knowledge system has. So I think I'm almost on my last slide here. So I'm hoping, Professor Nakata, that you are just super verbose today. But so the next step, and this is part of my project that we've just barely opened up, but the idea of being able to take Indigenous knowledge and now just like, so in archaeology, we have material culture. You find a couple of shovels, you find some drill bits, you find some refuge from, corn husks. And then you say, oh, look, they must have been an agricultural society and they ate corn and they must have farmed and used shovels. You find the material culture and then you build the story of what the civilization was. And so, similarly, just like how that's done in archaeology, the idea here that Foucault is suggesting is that you can do the same thing with knowledge. So in these records that we have where the knowledge has been fragmented, like by Haddon, um, the goal is to be able to identify what is the material culture? Where did this knowledge come from? Where did it emerge? Why was this significant? What were the authorities and the power pieces in play that made this knowledge significant or not significant? And then be able to grid it out and be able to, um, I don't want to say restore because I think that's the wrong word, but be able to go back to the origin of the knowledge without the Western framework filters. And that is going to be its own process, but that's where we've gone with this, at least within my project. Um, and I see that Professor Nakata is just like itching, like he's ready to just jump on this. So, did you have something that you want to pull in and add? And this is the end of my slides. I don't know if Professor Martin had submitted slides to you as well, Dwayne, but you'd be welcome to open those up. While you're doing that, though, I guess maybe this is a great time to open it up for questions within the room. Is there
We
any
might
questions?
we might continue and then leave the last half hour.
Okay, perfect, perfect.
So thank you, Elizabeth. Well done. I expect to see that in your thesis next week, and then we can submit the week after. Well done. So folks, thanks for coming this afternoon. So I'm going to pick up from where Elizabeth has finished to look at some of the ways that the rail track that she showed you earlier, and I'm going to talk about where the rail tracks cross over. So the intersections. At first, I'm going to stop here and acknowledge country. We are on Aboriginal country here on the mainland of Australia, and we're always very grateful to be speaking on their lands. And we pay our respect to the elders, past and present. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Kulkalai from the Torres Strait, and it's interesting that you asked for an example, Elizabeth, because this one has resonance to our talk here this afternoon, in that when you're researching Indigenous knowledge, sometimes the residues of the ancient knowledge sits in words. So in my language name of Kulkalai, the memory of our understandings of who we are as a person, as a people, and indeed my name is associated with a star. So that's when you're looking for through Indigenous knowledge to identify astronomical knowledge, you may find it in very unusual places, and that's the point. So for this afternoon, if I can pose this question for you. So what is a star? So Prof. Amaka, next slide, please. Some of you might say, well, balls of gas undergoing nuclear fusion, or maybe self-gravitating plasma spheres, or even objects classified by spectral types and luminosity. Others might reference stellar evolution, main sequence objects. These answers reflect rigorous training that you've had in astrophysics and astronomy generally. So today, though, the research opportunity, this question that I've just asked about the star reveals a fundamental research opportunity. Indigenous astronomical traditions contain different conceptualizations of time, space, distance, and celestial relationships that could provide novel solutions to problems that we as a global community struggle to address. Understanding complex environmental celestial correlations, developing sophisticated models of cyclical time, recognizing patterns in phenomena that don't fit our categorical frameworks are just some of our current challenges. Indigenous knowledge systems have been working with these relationships for millennia, using very different conceptual tools. So the research opportunity here for all of you isn't about documenting alternate beliefs or cultural curiosities, as Elizabeth pointed to, but it's about accessing fundamentally different ways of organizing astronomical knowledge that might yield breakthrough insights when brought into productive dialogue with Western frameworks. This is intellectual necessity for astronomy's advancement. The history of science shows repeatedly that breakthrough insights come from applying alternative conceptual frameworks to persistent problems. Indigenous astronomical knowledge represents a very vast repository of alternate frameworks that Western economy has barely begun to explore. The research challenges are these. How do we identify and extract these conceptual assets without destroying what makes them valuable? How do we bring different concepts of time, space, and celestial relationships into a productive tension to generate novel astronomical insight? Next slide, please. The star Western astronomers identify as Nakata, Torres Strait Islanders know this as Keck. But Keck isn't simply a different name. It's a fundamentally different object of knowledge. Keck exists through relationships to seasonal timing, ecological cycles, agricultural practices, and so on. Its heliacal rising marks wet season and arrival of the rains. And it's the time to plant yams. This represents sophisticated integration of celestial and terrestrial phenomena that Western astronomy systematically separates, where we divide astronomy from meteorology, from ecology. Torres Strait Islander knowledge maintains these connections, potentially revealing correlations our disciplinary boundaries obscure. This is just the beginning. Navigation stars in the Torres Strait Islander systems demonstrate even more complex integration, not valued for nuclear properties, but for their relationship with ocean currents, wind patterns, and land-finding techniques. This framework enabled voyaging across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, suggesting profound understanding of celestial environmental systems we're only just beginning to appreciate. But here's where it becomes truly interesting for contemporary research. Some stars simultaneously embody multiple temporal cycles that Western linear time struggles to model. They encode periodicities that integrate celestial, ecological, and social rhythms in ways that might offer new approaches to understanding complex cyclical phenomena, from climate patterns to ecosystems dynamics. Next slide, please. Modern astronomical classifications, spectral types, luminosity classes, stellar populations, enables discoveries from nucleosynthesis to gravitational waves. But every framework that makes certain phenomena visible makes others invisible. The International Astronomical Union, peer-reviewed journals, university physics department don't just house knowledge, they actively determine what can be known. Questions that don't fit the framework can't be formulated. Phenomena outside its categories become invisible or get dismissed as anomalies. Indigenous astronomical knowledge emerged through different institutional arrangements that made different phenomena visible. Elder councils correlating celestial and ecological cycles, navigation guilds developing integrated space-time concepts, ceremonial practices encoding multi-generational observations. These created different possibilities for understanding. So my point here is that the limitations aren't failures, they are boundaries. And at boundaries, complementary capabilities emerge. Next slide, please. Oh, you've gone too far, my friend.
All right.
Keep going. There, that one. So we already work in a space where multiple knowledge systems intersect, as Elizabeth has pointed out. What I have called over the years the cultural interface. This is an abstract theory, but the actual contemporary space where research happens. Both Western and Indigenous systems are sophisticated. Both emerge from specific historical conditions. Both make certain discoveries possible and others impossible. The opportunity lies in exploiting their different organizational principles to reveal what neither can see alone. Where Western astronomy sees isolated objects, Islanders see integrated systems. Where Indigenous knowledge sees cyclical patterns, Western science sees linear progressions. These aren't contradictions, as I said, to resolve, but they could be, if we look wisely enough, complementary lenses. So the cultural interface theory provides three operational principles for investigating Indigenous astronomical knowledge. Firstly, we've got to look at the locale, as Elizabeth pointed out. This is the place where we work every day in the contemporary settings with living knowledge systems that continue evolving, not pristine traditions frozen in time. They are not remnants of the past. The interface exists in everyday sites, research labs, field stations, data sets, wherever knowledge traditions converge. These locales are inherently problematic, revealing competing viewpoints about what counts as valid astronomical knowledge. By examining these specific sites, we can identify where different conceptual tools might be combined productively. This second aspect of my theory was to do with tensions. Different ways of understanding time, space, and causation create productive friction, generators of new possibilities, not problems to solve. When Western linear time meets Indigenous cyclical time, the tension isn't a barrier, but an opportunity to develop more sophisticated temporal models. These tensions reveal the boundaries of each system and create spaces where novel approaches emerge. They show us what each framework makes visible and what it obscures, pointing toward hybrid approaches that transcend either system alone. And the third concept that I built into the theory was this idea of the agency. This is recognizing all knowledge as constructed through human choices, opens possibilities for different choices that might yield different insights. Indigenous people aren't passive holders of traditional knowledge, but that they are active agents who've been navigating and adapting astronomical systems for millennia. They've been plussing the new with the old, as Elizabeth pointed out, strategically incorporating useful elements while maintaining core principles. This agency means collaboration isn't about extracting static knowledge, but engaging with dynamic systems that continue evolving through Indigenous innovations. Next one, please, Prof. Hamaka. So to identify valuable conceptual tools in Indigenous astronomical knowledge, we need to understand how these different systems constitute their objects differently. Consider for a moment how Western astronomy creates stars as objects. Through spectroscopy, revealing chemical composition, nuclear physics explaining energy production, evolutionary models predicting life cycles. The Constitution enables certain questions: stellar age, distance, mass, while making others unaskable. But how do we actually study the way Indigenous systems constitute their astronomical knowledge? The method that Elizabeth pointed out by Michel Foucault provides a systematic approach on how we can excavate the knowledge that exists out there. And we can begin by identifying the surfaces of where they emerge, not just where, but how astronomical phenomena become objects of Indigenous knowledge. These surfaces aren't physical locations, but the practices where celestial objects gain meaning. Seasonal gathering sites where elders correlate star appearances with resource availability, navigation training where stars become directional markers integrated with currents and winds, ceremonial context where celestial cycles structure social time. By documenting these surfaces, we begin to understand how astronomical objects are constituted through lived practice rather than abstract observations. We can then get below the surface and start to examine the authorities that determine what counts as valid astronomical knowledge within Indigenous systems. Navigation masters verify stellar knowledge through successful voyages across thousands of kilometers. Ceremonial leaders validate correlation between celestial and ecological cycles through generations of observed patterns. These authorities maintain rigorous empirical standards through different validation methods than Western peer review, but they're no less systematic or reliable. And finally, we can explicate the grids that Elizabeth spoke about that specifies how things need to be, and to reveal how Indigenous systems organize astronomical phenomena in ways that create fundamentally different objects. Stars grouped by their role in predicting spawning cycles, their correlation with weather patterns, the integration with tidal movements. These aren't just different classifications, but different constitutions that embody temporal spatial relationships Western astronomy doesn't recognize as astronomical data. Once you've documented how knowledge systems constitute the astronomical objects, we can then stitch things back together with all the underlying principles to provide a bigger picture of the spatial and temporal concepts that lie within them. Indigenous temporal frameworks that track multiple simultaneous cycles didn't emerge abstractly, but through millennia of needing to predict resource availability, navigation conditions, and seasonal changes. Their relational spatial concept developed through the practical necessity of finding tiny islands across vast ocean. These aren't primitive approximations, but sophisticated conceptual tools that solve complex real-world problems. Next slide, please. So for this afternoon, here are a couple of tips for your research practice. Firstly, target fundamental concepts where different frameworks offer different tools. Indigenous concept of cyclical time might help model complex periodicities in climate systems. Relational concepts of space might inform understanding of gravitational interactions. Integrated frameworks might reveal astronomical environmental correlations we've missed. Second, focus on persistent problems in Western astronomy that Indigenous frameworks approach differently. Consider how a Torres Strait Islander integration of multiple simultaneous cycles might address challenges in modeling coupled oscillations in Earth systems, or how their navigation frameworks, which successfully predicted conditions across vast ocean distances, might offer insights into long-range correlation patterns. Third, you could develop hybrid models that selectively combine conceptual tools. A research team might use Western spectroscopic data within Indigenous relational frameworks to identify new patterns, or apply Indigenous temporal concepts to Western datasets to reveal hidden periodicities. And finally, you could test empirically whether Indigenous conceptual tools reveal patterns Western frameworks missed. Do Torres Strait Islander seasonal correlations predict environmental changes our models can't? Do their spatial concept identify celestial relationship we've overlooked? So here's some final thoughts coming to at the end of the session. We face today planetary scale challenges, climate disruption, ecosystem collapse, complex environmental challenges that neither Western science nor Indigenous alone has solved. These challenges involve exactly the kinds of complex, multi-scale, cyclical phenomena that Indigenous astronomical frameworks were developed to understand. Island astronomy succeeded in integrating celestial, oceanic, even atmospheric patterns for survival in challenging environments. These aren't quaint traditions, but sophisticated systems that work for us. The conceptual tools they develop, different ways of understanding time, space, and systemic relationships, might be exactly what we need. This isn't about choosing between knowledge systems. It's about recognizing that breakthrough solutions often emerge at the intersection of different ways of thinking. Indigenous astronomical knowledge contains conceptual tools we might benefit from. Accessing and applying these tools could generate novel insights needed for planetary scale challenges. So let me close by asking again, what is a star? I asked this question for a particular reason. I was asking whether we're prepared to recognize that our answer represents only one way of organizing knowledge. The breakthroughs we seek might require conceptual tools that already exist in other knowledge traditions. The future of astronomy, and perhaps our ability to understand and respond to planetary changes, depends on our willingness to work at the cultural interface, not to document or preserve Indigenous knowledge, but to collaborate in developing novel solutions using combined conceptual resources. The question for us all now is whether we can recognize our frameworks as partial and Indigenous frameworks as containing essential tools that we could benefit from. The advancement of astronomy and our response to planetary challenges might well depend on it. Thank you. Now for questions.
Thank you, Professor Nakata and Elizabeth both. Especially Elizabeth, I know it's 1 o'clock in the morning for you in Melbourne, Florida, by the way, which is named after this Melbourne. Do we have any questions for either Elizabeth or Professor Nakata? Questions, comments? Yes? Go ahead.
Okay. Should we try to get the audio from the room?
Yes. Well, I mean, we can hear you now, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Probably from me. I'm close enough here.
Can you pull down the slide?
Sorry?
Pull down slide. Yeah. Okay.
Now I can see you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks to both of you. I've got a bit of a comment. I don't want to go into this kind of full scale about what is Western knowledge, because of course it's itself dynamic. But first, a little bit about your analogies. First, the analogy of the tree, I think it's really working well. You may be aware or may not be aware that there is actually a classic Western philosophical precedent for that, the so-called Porphyrian tree from the late Greek philosopher Porphyry, who basically used that as a teaching method. You have to understand that knowledge is structured and you have to envisage that as a tree, and you can find every place of every bit of knowledge on that tree. So in that way, also that part, with respect to the rails and the bridges, I was a bit more hesitant. I think in history and philosophy of science, when people do analogies about knowledge these days, they very much like to think about ecosystems, because knowledge is dynamic, it's moving, it's static. And maybe at that point, I thought maybe two different rivers or river systems might be better, that you could connect by canals in that way. That might be the analogy, which also makes clear that if you do you can do some serious damage by canal building on ecosystems. But on the other hand, you can also have water flowing both ways. The one thing I was, and that's probably more to Martin Nakata than to you, but you both mentioned Foucault's archaeology of knowledge. I'm not quite understanding, and maybe you can help me with that, how that works with Indigenous knowledge systems particularly well, given that Foucault has a very strong idea of the archive. And while it involves material culture, it is to a large extent this kind of bulk of written material from history that he finds, and then he goes through that like an archaeologist in these kind of layers to develop his own stratigraphy. How is this working with Indigenous knowledge systems, particularly with oral Indigenous knowledge systems? You, of course, have a lot of material culture that you can use this, but to get to this kind of genealogy of knowledge where Foucault wants to get to, how does that work?
I'll happily take that one, Elizabeth. Yeah, Foucault's work is quite extensive, as you well know, and I think the French term for the archive is the oeuvre, I think. And what we're talking about is a corpus of knowledge in both certain situations. And with that archive, there needs to be some tools that you could use to excavate. Hence the term archaeology has a particular focus on the formation of objects, which is what we've been talking about today. So if you're talking about astronomical knowledge, we're trying to render that as an object and asking the very important question about the formation of the object. There's a chapter in Archaeology of Knowledge, published in 1972, has 3 compartments for the excavation. The first one is to look at the surfaces of emergence. That's where things pop up in the everyday, the things that we cycle through as common sense, and you capture the kind of mentions of astronomical features. But what we've then required to do in the archaeological use by using the archaeological tool is to get below the surface to look at the authorities of delimitation. And he explains that in a way that gets us to see not who's doing it and who's authorizing it, but the apparatuses of knowledge that actually drives knowledge to be cohered in one way and not the other. And that's a challenge when you're trying to get below the surface, is you're trying to understand what are the organizing features of this so that you can fully understand what is rising to the surface as in situ to that organizing system. And the third concept in the formational object that he illuminates on is really about how you then need to understand how they set up and relate to each other in terms of their individual specificities. So that way you can understand how those objects actually form in a particular way that gets communicated in other ways and not others. So those 3 elements is a tool that I've coached Elizabeth in. So if you're going to investigate knowledge tradition, we're going to look at it as an object, and we're going to look at its formation, and we're going to look at how it actually establishes itself as a way to understand the phenomena. So that's how it works. And the genealogy, as you know from his work in Madness and Civilization, as well as the 6 volumes on sexuality, this is really about how to stitch the whole thing back together using its own foundations, its own principles, and its own reasoning system to explain why those things surface in the way they do at the time when they emerge and gets communicated. And that way you preserve what is spoken from its own meaning-making machine and not colonize it from another discipline. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
So now the issue about the rail is one that is really more apt for the dimensions of the contemporary area, where we as social beings are trained to think in lanes. And so that's what we have today. That's how people read the world today. And that's how we become known as culturally different, as opposed to the center. And those 2 run parallel to each other. And we as social beings think that the world just runs in different lanes. What we've tried to bring today is a conversation about how this crosses over, how it muddles up everything, and it makes it even more difficult for us to be able to go and understand traditional knowledge. Hence the need to be able to develop, adopt tools so that we can start to excavate that in a way to find its meaning-making machine so that we can then represent what people are telling us about astronomical traditions. Hence the comment I made to Elizabeth, she's done so well this year. It's only taken her 6 months. It took me 6 years. So I think she should have got to the front of the class.
Thank you so
No,
much.
but I agree actually, Gayard, with the idea of the water analogy. I do see that working as well. Specifically here in Florida, we're not too far from the Kennedy Space Center. And one of the things about where the Kennedy Space Center is located, it's actually on an island. And you have the Pacific Ocean on one side, and then you have the rivers from Florida coming out. And what happens is you end up with this brackish water in the middle, and it has its own ecosystem. It has its own species. It has its own weather. That's part of why the Kennedy Space Center is where it is, because that brackish water actually blows away most of the hurricanes in Florida. So I think that there is also some value in what you're suggesting, right? Especially where Professor Nakata is talking about this hybridization of knowledge, right? So you're taking two completely different ecosystems, and now we're creating something, that synergizes and isn't just, compartmentalizing one into another. But mentally for me, I visualize the track more because and I can see um, I can see the idea behind that as well.
It just reminds me, Elizabeth, there's Arnhem Land, Aboriginal people in Arnhem Land talk about this brackish water as the gunma. And gunma is exactly that. And they've used that same brackish water to explain the overlapping traditions. So I should send you that, and that would be a good reference for it.
Excellent. Other questions? Then I turn it towards you.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, and this was wonderful. And I come from philosophy, and I really love this concept of the cultural interface. Can you hear me?
Sorry, it's a little bit. I'll see if I can push this over.
But I shout.
You can go pretty far.
Yeah, I'll shout. Okay, thank you so much for both presentation, and thank you so much for this concept of the cultural interface. It's so rich, it's so inspiring. Now, I come from philosophy, and we don't have the luxury of we don't have the kind of intellectual high standards of having a topic that is scientific, that is empirically studied. And so I was wondering if when you talk about these two rails, right, and when you talk about the possibility of bridges, I found that this was a message of incredible hope that there could be bridges. But I see in my discipline that people, settlers, are really super interested in this concept of the cultural interface. They are hopeful that something like bridges would happen, but they are just panicked by feeling like this is just way too hard. And if we just start, we are going to end up, doing more damage than good. So they place that in the too hard basket. And I think it's partly because, as I said, we're not in the scientific empirical environment. So in philosophy, we have foundational global aspirations. And there is a feeling as if we try to kind of go towards this interface, then we are going to be extractive. And there is no way as settler to avoid this. And so I see all my colleagues feeling like, oh my God, I'm aware that we need to do that, but at the same time, this is way too hard, right? We just need to unlearn. We need to kind of get ready to listen, to self-educate, but there is no way currently for the two rails to have bridges. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, look, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's always the refrain that it's a difficult space to be in, and that's why we've chosen to work in here. And these are why PhD topics are really appropriate for these kind of investigations. They're exploratory, they're experimental, but high chance of innovation. And the way we try and explain that to hard scientists there, not the philosophers alone, that we've gotten ourselves as a modern society now where we're just citing ourselves. We're in a bowl like fish, and we're just citing each other. And the only real point for innovation now is to have a reference point outside of the bowl. The Indigenous knowledge in that other compartment sits outside of that, as you well know. So yes, it's difficult, but yes, it's also the opportunity for real innovation. And a lot of this stuff that I play around with, and I'm not a hard scientist. I'm like you. I'm a social scientist. Did quite a bit around philosophy as well, and I found philosophy actually very helpful. And particularly Plato's work around the allegory of the caves to try and expose the kind of fishbowl, and in his case, the shadows on the cave wall, that where we've come to believe that the shadows are the only world that we're in until someone leaves and goes outside the cave and says, oh, actually, there's clouds out here. Um, and that's the way I think like some of the Western science has been evolving, is that they've so now closed in, they think they know everything about the world. And they now believe exactly that they've expired their whole knowledge system and they have everything. But the good scientists and the good philosophers are always out there saying, well, where's the next horizon? What's over there? Why shouldn't we be asking these very difficult questions? Why shouldn't we undertake these very difficult challenges? And when we do, just put PhD students in front of you and then let them do the work.
Raise your hand if you're doing that. Excellent. Anybody else want
Can I jump in there, Dwayne? Is it okay, or is there someone else in the room?
Go ahead.
And sorry, I have to go do school pickup, so I'm sorry if my connectivity is not very good. Hi, thank you so much to both of you for some really interesting talks there and for this stimulating discussion. It's fabulous. Thank you. I'm Rachel. I work mainly in environmental research these days, although I have a background in astronomy as well. And I think it's been really interesting to think through the slight differences in where we're at, practically speaking, in terms of, railway tracks and two-way knowledge and all the different sort of metaphors and ideas that have come up here, particularly because, and Professor Nakata, I'm sure you're very much across this, in Australia, the practical discussion about having to work together in ecological contexts has, in a sense, necessitated, I think, at least for some Western trained scientists, just an awareness that there's not really a choice anymore, but to try and work in these spaces in between and to find ways of knowing together. And just to add further to the conversation, I think it's also, for many of the people I work with, the language of right-way science has become more comfortable than the two-way knowledge because of the idea, and that's really about right-way for contexts and for places and for, and for challenges in country. It's been a lot more about the fact that there are multiple directions that knowledge flows in, and the fact that these are ecosystems that are yes, have there are distinct purposes, but there are multiple lines by which knowledge can come together, multiple Indigenous groups, multiple perspectives, as well as contested views within Western knowledge contexts and systems and across disciplines. So I find it really interesting to sort of think through. My original background is in anthropology, and that training about the importance of really understanding and respecting differences across cultural lines and really not being ethnocentric and all of that is very ingrained in me. But I think there are some really interesting spaces and conversations emerging around collaboration. And just to finish, Professor Nakata, I just really, really appreciate what you're saying about knowledge getting stuck right now, and the need for these spaces to open up new solutions and new ways of thinking. So thank you mainly, but also any thoughts on that?
Professor?
Elizabeth, you can speak to that. Elizabeth is just coming into this, and I've chucked her in the deep end, and
Yes.
and she's beginning to swim, and
Yeah,
so yeah, no,
barely.
it's really been exciting adventure for me over the last 20 years. But for Elizabeth, it's fairly fresh, and the wounds are still healing, I guess, Elizabeth. And she's skinned her knees a few times, but we're spurred on by the novel aspect of the whole thing. You know, what are the breakthroughs here? What can we imagine on the other side here? What if we were to find some different kind of temporal and spatial knowledge here that might help the conversation around some of the global challenges we face today, Rachel. And yes, the ecologists and environmentalists and the climate scientists have been very, very quick on the pickup of this, and they've been moving quite rapidly. And you know the Centre of Excellence for Indigenous environmental histories and futures that we have up here. So over 100 scientists and PhD students and generally HDR students. They're all getting taught into the cultural interface dimension so that they can have a much richer grounds for novel outcomes.
It's fabulous, and not to undermine what you're saying there, Elizabeth. I totally agree. It's a hard journey, and it's not a simple set of answers because there's power as well, and you have to be really aware of the entrenched structural issues behind all this. So yeah, really appreciating you both.
Yeah, I was just going to add, Rachel, that it's interesting that you bring up the ecology applications of this as well, because when I'm still trying to get my brain around the Foucault's archaeology of knowledge aspect of this, but the places where you can see published actual applications where this has been successful is in ecological applications, but also in medical and the plant botany type frameworks. And so I think you're right that there's definitely it's a recognized importance of integrating these two and figuring out how to do it more and better.
Other questions? Anybody else? Yeah, Jack, hang on. They can't see you there, so hold on.
Yes, I thank you so much for those incredible presentations, both of you. You spoke a lot, particularly on the research aspect and how important it is we have these in our research in these different frameworks, and where we can find the crossover. Do you think that extends into education as well? And how, is it important that students get these opportunities to try these different frameworks and be exposed to these different frameworks early in their educational career?
Look, thank you very much for that question. And for the others in the room, can you ask questions of Elizabeth? I feel like I'm hogging the afternoon here, but I'm a trained teacher, and so most of the interface work has happened in the education space. Mm-hmm. And we've done multiple empirical studies using the theory, and we've come up with some very, very novel outcomes. So study of Indigenous men's expressions and understandings of anger, working with forensic psychologists and clinical psychologists. By the time they learned how to approach things from the interface position, they wrote a piece that said it made psychology look pathetic. Because up until that point, psychology has thought that anger resided in your head. And so all you have to do is fix the head. So we come along with interface theory and show that this is a convergence of sorts, and that we had to ask different make different inquiries of how these things intersect, of life, of being Indigenous, being colonized, in the face of colonized people, asking very, very different questions. And what we found was it wasn't in your head, but it was actually the impoverished language of men not being able to express their feelings. So here they are building rehabilitation programs that made men more angry, and completely missing the point that men hit out early because they can't express their feelings. So, and then in schools, so we've been doing very different works in school, particularly around the maths and science curriculum, the Australian curriculum. We've been working with 19 schools and 4,500 students, applying these things into the way that education systems are designed and delivered. And we've surfaced there quite a very different kind of understanding of why academic performance is so down. We've also just finished and wrote a book about undergraduate students and how we applied different understandings of Indigenous students in universities and how they need to be supported as they go through. And we built a new science from this space about learning support, and we trialed that over a 5-year period. And the first year we halved attrition, and in 4 years we doubled the graduation rate of Indigenous students without ATARs. So we're applying the theory, and I've got several other projects that we're doing where we've been just testing this space. And we've come up with some very, very, not just novel, but things that are now benefiting Indigenous people.
Amazing, brilliant. That is incredible. That's an incredible observation, especially that stuff on the language of men and the differences. That's because I have struggled to define the way the different frameworks work. That explanation of the Western psychology of it in the head and then the Indigenous perspective of it being the language. That's an incredible. Thank you for that, Professor.
I really encourage you guys to break a leg here. You know, like reach outside of the fishbowl. There's lots to learn, and if you can get onto an Indigenous standpoint, you've got a reference point outside of the bowl. And we just did this. Sorry to hog it here, Elizabeth, but we just did this with our current enterprise bargaining table, where we've introduced a third component into the mix, like a third reference point. So it's not now a pitch battle between employees and the rights of staff, but go for it and fight all you like. But what is the purpose of that fight? Does it actually add value to the communities? And so by entering a third position, we've now introduced a tripartite responsibility framework so that the net effect of all the fighting means that the contribution to the community is greater. Very, very smart stuff. Just by reaching out and grabbing a reference point from outside the bowl and marrying it to the assets you've got in the bowl, and you get this real breakthrough.
Brilliant.
Anybody else have anything they want to ask, talk about? Ask Elizabeth. Yep.
Hi, thanks so much. Thank you. I guess I just want to pick your brains about the idea that using cultural interface to talk about knowledge systems which are neither Western nor Indigenous. How does that kind of fit in? Where do you think that fits into the whole idea? And do you know any examples of using cultural interface to look at Indigenous knowledges, different Indigenous knowledges together? Yeah, thank you.
I'd hope you'd ask a question for Elizabeth.
I mean, as well.
So I do a lot of work around knowledge production. And once you start to delve into how knowledge is produced, you get the sense of the organizing systems. Hence the point that Elizabeth talked about. It's just not the artifacts called Indigenous knowledge, but the organizing system. And I took 150 years of written material on Torres Strait Islanders and I explicated all of the writings to try and understand genealogically how this all fitted and what made it cohere to all the way through the ages and how things actually shifted in the process. And there are these binary systems that goes to your logic and reasoning, and that sits at the heart of this. And you see that evolving over time. And the real change comes when the binary pair shifts. And when that shifts, you get a very different trajectory. So for me, that's the exciting part of trying to understand systems, because you can then really get to the heart of why things are translated and communicated one way and not the other.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I always feel there's about a million questions I want to ask, but I know that I've got a lot of reading to do and a lot of reflection to do before I get into that part.
We got a half an hour, and I really would like you to ask Elizabeth some questions.
Yeah.
She stayed up all night. I feel really bad.
I mean, I think seeing Elizabeth's journey transition so markedly in 6 months has been quite powerful. Um, I feel, Elizabeth, you've done more in 6 months than I have in 6 years, particularly in this particular space, which is great. But how is it? I mean, I'm just kind of curious where you see your work going in this direction now. Both as somebody who's curious about this, also as a co-advisor, but
I mean, I think that obviously this archaeology of knowledge, this conversation of being able to um, take the astronomical knowledge that we have, and there are so many records, right? Already we've had in Esley all the interviews that you did when you went to the Torres Strait, like all of that, right, can be encompassed in that kind of analysis. But um, as part of that, like some of the things that Professor Nakata hinted at as he was talking about, like the different aspects of that process, like the grids of specification and all that. He talks about, okay, well now maybe you're going to create this hybridized knowledge. And I think the output still potentially ends where we imagined before we even started down this process, but with a different perspective.
Hmm.
And so, maybe it is still some of that. Hey, look, let's look at this star and its position, and let's combine that with the meteorological, um, data, and let's be able to graphically show that. But we're doing it more holistically, I guess. And then, so I guess that's kind of the real answer is I don't know. I don't know yet, right? Because this is a process, and I don't know that I even understand the Foucault archaeology of knowledge super well. Certainly not enough to be able to really apply it yet, but I do think there is potential still to get more technical, to still be able to convey this astronomy um, in ways that will benefit both disciplines, so to speak, I guess.
No, that's a good
I
point.
don't know that that answers your question, but
I mean,
yeah.
well, yeah, it does. I mean, I'm in a similar kind of boat. I don't always know either. I mean, this is one of the challenges working with different communities around Melbourne, the Kulin Nations. We're doing similar kinds of project. The communities say that different elders have different bits of knowledge, but not many people have a comprehensive understanding of traditional knowledge in any of those one communities. There's a lot of stuff scattered around. There's stuff in the archive.
Mm.
The stuff in the archive is wrong to various degrees. And we can identify some of that, and some of that we can't.
Mhm.
The communities have outputs they want to see this knowledge applied to. For example, astrotourism, educational curricula. But I think as part of the process, there's going to be a new sort of approach that's going to take as it starts to form. It becomes something more tangible. The communities are going to identify with that and then want to be able to take that in new directions we aren't even thinking about right now. So
Right.
it's one of the interesting things. I'm looking at these parallels with what you're doing, what I've done in the past, and with what I'm trying to set up now with these other projects we have going. It's a big challenge. And then we've got these ideas about how can we apply the cultural interface to astrophysics? How can we work on trying to take that massive amount of inertia and get in the astrophysics or any of the hard science community, but especially in physics and astronomy, to kind of come on board and even understand what this stuff is about, or why they should do it, and why their perspective on everything isn't the end all be all. And that's something I have a lot of difficulty with, because every time that I think that I've gotten the astronomical community in this direction, I realize that we've taken 6 steps forward and 5 steps back. That we're making progress, but it's never as much as I want. And I think that there's a lot of acknowledgement. There's a lot of performative acknowledgement with the astrophysics community and saying, yes, we know this needs to be done, but when you really press them on stuff, their attitudes haven't really changed that much. And that's something that the last 6 months has taught me in a quite a jarring way, I think. Perhaps it's a bit of naivety on my part, thinking that we've gotten a lot further than we have. But there's been some interesting conversations we've had in this space. But at the same time, we're doing this stuff in, largely in a physics department, even though we're over in Arts West working with all the arts people. This delineation of, this half of campus is arts and that half is science is part of the problem anyway. But
so we talking about two different things, right? The one you're talking about now is how do you change a profession? Is that what you were talking about?
Well, there's a bit of both. There's what are the new things we can learn about? What's the new novel aspects by combining these worlds? But there's also the aspect of just shifting the community of astrophysics to, bring this kind of content and discussion and discourse in when it's still quite firmly outside.
So the point I was going to make was you can't ask them to change. So you've got to change the culture from inside. So if students are producing these novel works going forward, at some point the snowball gets bigger and starts to roll on its own. But there are things that we can do more strategically too, in terms of the way that we can communicate ourselves to the world, the world's collegiate on astronomical fields. So we've got the conference coming up in September. Is it September or October? And we're currently trying to craft the plenary on that to try and signal these very significant things, so that the world community understands this is not about curios, but try to communicate some knowledge about the potential assets that may sit within. And that could help some of the broader, more bigger narratives around the discipline itself. But there's also opportunity at that conference for the kind of networks, not just with researchers, but, astronauts are coming as well. There's going to be engineers there, and on all the different fields of astronomy are now picking up on Indigenous knowledge. And I know there will be different conversations at the conference. So I wouldn't be too concerned about putting energy into changing the field. I think the field is changing. It's already changing. We would never have gotten an invitation if not for the likes of you guys who have been on the ground evolving these conversations. So take heart that the ball is already starting to move, and always the last one will be the traditionalists in the disciplines, and then after a while you'll find that they'll come running, particularly when the novel stuff starts to kick in.
Right. The DART mission approach. You get to the asteroid and just keep pushing at it, keep tugging at it until you move the field where it needs to go. Gerhard, did you have something you wanted to say?
Okay, yeah, maybe a bit too late, but sorry, another question from Martin Nakata. Because I was wondering when Dwayne mentioned, yes, this kind of collaboration, how far, because I mean, the idea of the cultural interface I found very interesting, but also in some sense, a bit familiar to things we do all the time when we work between different academic disciplines. Because, of course, once you start digging into that community, you realize, oh, the colleagues next door in the different department think very, very different about this. So because, yes, in some way, knowledge systems, say, between physics and biology, are not as compatible as people believe when they don't talk to each other. Obviously, there are differences in terms of colonial legacy and the dominating power of modern science in this kind of colonization process. But how far would you think is the idea of cultural interface something that you can find not just when you talk about indigenous versus Western science knowledge systems, but also between different knowledge systems wherever they are.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, look, I'm from the social science field, and we've been doing that for ages. We've come through various kind of traditions of intersecting knowledge systems. And what I've found that these forms like transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, they essentially basically says, I'm sticking with my tools and I'm going to cross your paths and you can learn my tools. And those narrow intersecting lines is pretty much the kind of typical way that the social sciences have tried to communicate across each other. And I read a lot of research grants at the ARC level, and I see these mentions of transdisciplinary and cross-cultural and trans everything into this, and it's no more than another assertion of what they already do. What the interface does is it takes a position much, much broader than that. And it looks at whole knowledge traditions converging, not just intersections of particular viewpoints. And that's been the difference, to try and understand the complexities of the everyday space as being multi-layered with a whole lot of legacy issues sitting in that space, where two intersecting lines are never going to be able to give you enough frame to capture the complexity in that space. Hence, the three principles that are built in there around the locale as being really, really dense. The tensions that things are driven one way or another because of the way the apparatus works inside of there. And then the agencies that we still have individuals in there making decisions, albeit within the constraint of the conditioning of that kind of contemporary space. Whereas with the intersecting lines, you've got the us and them still operating. You still have, the simplistic causation reasoning. There's all very, very simplistic things. And basically, it's what we call in education institutional accommodation. But there's nothing methodologically innovative about what they do.
Is anybody online? I know we've got a few people joining us online. Does anybody online have any questions or issues they'd like to raise? I'm not sure who's still online at this point.
I had a bit of a chat to Elizabeth after she presented at the conference, and she said she'd had just some immediate takeaways from presenting. And I just thought, Elizabeth, did you want to share a couple of those just here today? Because yeah, it was interesting that you had some immediate insights like directly after you spoke. So
is it
putting you on the
so
spot.
bad that I don't
Sorry.
remember what I said, Amanda? I remember talking to you, but I'm like, wait, I don't know what I said.
And we kind of talked a bit about how the change in tack from what you had originally approached it as, and then kind of changing methodological approach and kind of fundamental thought processes to do with the work, which you've kind of talked on today a little bit too. But just the fact that you kind of spoke of it immediately after, I just thought was, put you on the spot.
Yeah, and I think part of that too has just been part of this process, right? So in the work I presented at the conference, that was all done and published in April of 2024. So it's been, almost a year and a half since then. And then this process of understanding the cultural interface, all of that has been in the last 6 months. And I think for me, the takeaway was also like kind of what I was saying with Professor Dwayne, like it doesn't mean that the previous work doesn't have value. It doesn't mean that we can't go and take this knowledge and get technical with it and and create those hybrid systems of understanding. But it does mean that we have to reconsider why. Why are we doing that? And I think with the um, uh, one thing that I learned, like I was so excited about figuring out this graphing method I could use in Stellarium and being able to overlay them in Excel and be able to see, hey, look, here's the rainfall and here's Keck and it's setting and here's the heliacal rise and this is so cool. Yeah, it's no longer like originally I saw it as a way to prove, right? This is me verifying what they were saying about Keck. And now it can just be, hey, here's a way to visually represent this, but I'm not verifying anything. It's just, I'm trying to put it on paper because this is an oral knowledge that's multi-layered and it needs, um, or I need to be able to make sense out of it. I need a different way to be able to visualize it. Um, I don't know if that's along the lines of what I talked about at the conference. That whole week is a little bit of a blur for me. I'm going to blame it on the 15-hour time difference, but yeah.
No, it was. We were kind of talking about the graphs and how they looked really pretty and they were really interesting, but you were kind of like, well, the purpose of them is kind of moot now based on the research you've been doing. But I think being able to provide that visual layer is helpful in the knowledge that, as you say, is dynamic, it's ongoing, and it uses the other physical senses. It's not just about hearing a story, it's about engaging with other senses. And I think having at least a visual representation there enables a little bit of that in a paper medium. So yeah, and I mean, I thought the graphs themselves were quite interesting, just in how you could overlay the data and show something quite complex in a little bit of a slightly simplified way. But yeah.
Right. Right. And that wasn't something that I've addressed today, but inherently, anytime you're dealing with Indigenous knowledge systems, and we talk about that, you know, that iceberg of all those factors that play into it, how can you take that and express it in writing a sentence? It's just impossible, right? So like you said, you know, the value of having multiple ways of, okay, let's throw in some visualization, let's create more ways to transmit this knowledge than just simply saying a sentence like Keck Falls. That doesn't tell me anything about what that really means to these people. So
I think one of the bigger challenges that we face in this ties into motivation. So with some of the work that I'd focused on, and kind of one of the angles I was going with this, and what I did in my book as well, it can come off in one way. So I've had people say, "Oh, it's great in Dwayne's book that he compares Western Indigenous knowledge." Like, I'm not comparing them. I'm not trying to show how close Indigenous knowledge came to Western science. I'm showing Indigenous knowledge had figured a lot of the stuff out before Western science did. That was the whole point behind a lot of that. But also with the argument that there's no science here when there is. But that's a very sort of a narrow approach to that. So I've worked with the Torres Strait Regional Authority on assisting with aspects of their seasonal calendars they're putting in schools, and I can see aspects of the seasonal calendars are wrong, not because the elders, you know, presented knowledge incorrectly, but because the people who were translating it from one language to another, one medium to another, made a lot of mistakes. And I've seen, I just got a book a few weeks ago. It was a year 7 textbook for Queensland. And there was a whole chapter on Indigenous astronomy, and they were talking about how the Pleiades were the constellation of Bezom. And I'm like, whoa, hang on, whoa, that's not right at all. I know that's not right. It's the stars of Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, you know, it's these stars. And what are they talking about? Because there's stuff out there on websites that just sort of mention, oh, it's 7 stars, so it must be the Pleiades. It's a morning star, it must be Venus. I'm like, that's not the case at all. And I actually emailed the people back because they were asking me about an image permission on a totally different part of the chapter. And I was reading through it, and I'm like, this thing is riddled with mistakes. So I emailed them back and I was like, you need to fix all these things. Um, so in that case, I'm not correcting what elders said that was wrong because the elders said that things that were right, obviously. Even though there are times mistakes can come through, but it was the transcription and translation issues that came through. So with Mabiog's notebook, that was all written in Kalalagoya. And there were a team of linguists who went through and then translated it and then interpreted what that meant. So like initially part of the work with Esley's notebook was never to test whether or not Esley got his stuff right. Of course he got his stuff right. But it was what did, because there's lots of footnotes within that saying, well, we think Keck may be Venus, but here this person says Keck is Achernar. This person says Keck is something else. So I'm like, well, let's go in and have a look. And then when you look at how the sky works, it's very easy to figure out which star they're talking about, which ties in, very closely with making sure that we get the stuff accurate when we're talking about specific stars or specific objects in the sky. And that's where a lot of those challenges were coming through. So even in that somewhat early work, looking at Esley's notebooks, so the motivation, of course, is not to test and see whether or not Esley got his knowledge right. It's testing to see whether the translation, transcription of knowledge from one form to another was done accurately. And then we're seeing places where it's not. And then there are even times where I would question certain things, like the elders will talk about how the nose of Bezon touching the horizon, you would see lightning and the thunderstorms kicking off the wet season. And I remember looking, I'm like, but the nose of the shark touches the horizon in June. We're talking that transition would be later in the year and sort of like November, December. And I remember asking Uncle Aldo Tapim, one of the elders, and he sat and explained to me, that my thinking of it was a bit off. And he sat and explained to me what it meant. And it was more that the shark was diving into the sea at that point. And even though I'm looking at exactly when that star is on the horizon at this time of the day, matching those up, he's like, it's a bit more idiosyncratic than that. It's about the shark diving into the sea and conceptualizing it in a different way. And that water rushing through the shark's gills coming up and falling as a seasonal rain. So it was really good at helping me to see things in different ways that I hadn't thought about because I'm looking at these sort of limited rules within the context of cultural astronomy research, but also what we can do with these sorts of translations and transcriptions and how we can go through and try to correct some of the records. So, there's some challenges in there for me too, which I think are quite interesting, but this is part of what we're grappling with here, isn't it?
Well, and I just love that example because I think it really highlights again the need to work in collaboration with the group that you're researching, right? You wouldn't have that perspective except that you talked to Aloe and he was able to explain it all to you. It was interesting for me. So at the conference, at the dinner, Mary shared the story of the coyote who wanted a job and he was given this bag full of coins or whatever, and he was supposed to give it to the person and he runs and he trips and then all the stars come into the sky or whatever. And so the next day I talked to Mary and I was like, wow, I just really loved that story. Like that was so meaningful to me to hear it from you. And I'm like, yeah, and there was so much implicit knowledge in there that wasn't shared, but it's teaching you these cultural lessons about life and she interrupted me at that point in a good way. She's like, yeah, it's telling you all about how you got to finish your job. You need, and all this stuff. And that was not what I got out of that story. And it was just really a reminder to me again of these frameworks, right? Culturally, I'm used to thinking and coming to conclusions based on my experience, but her experience has been totally different. And that story meant something completely different to her, even though we both heard it. And I would have never come to the conclusion that she shared with me about what the moral of that story was. So yeah, you can't do this kind of work without that input and collaboration.
Yeah. How often in cultural astronomy work have we been trying to figure out what star object they talking to, and you actually sit and talk to the other, and they're like, you're completely off. It's not even close.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, yeah, it's good to see that kind of rupture happening in our thinking. Does anybody else have anything they want to, because we've only got a couple more minutes left? Well, I would like to thank both of you, especially Elizabeth for sticking up for 2 hours. It's going to be 2 o'clock in the morning for you now. Thank you for staying up and speaking to us, and thank you, Professor Martin. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording of this.